Gone to the Rapture, The Time Bubble Book 14, by Jason Ayres. Narrated by Samuel James. Chapter 1. July 2023. As the sun beat down on a glorious July afternoon, veteran lorry driver Jake Rogers was driving his HGV south on the M40. He was looking forward to getting back to his family in Oxford after a long journey down from Manchester. Most of July had been wet and cool, a disappointment after a series of good summers, but today had brought a welcome change. The sky was a deep shade of blue, with fluffy white clouds scattered across the horizon. Fields of golden wheat and lush green pastures stretched out on either side of the motorway, dotted with patches of wildflowers and hedgerows. The trees along the roadside cast short shadows from a sun that was still high in the sky, their leaves rustling gently in the warm breeze. As Jake drove past the Junction 9 exit for Bicester and on towards Oxford, he thought about his wife and teenage children, and how much he was going to enjoy the evening ahead. It was his birthday, not a big one, that would be next year, but even so, he knew his wife would have gone all out for his special day. She always did. They had a barbecue planned, and he couldn't wait to sink his teeth into her homemade burgers, not to mention the many other goodies she would have picked up from their favourite butcher in Oxford's famous covered market. It was a home he was destined never to reach. He had not a hint of what was about to happen or why, but if anyone had been peering into his cab at the fateful moment, they would have seen something inexplicable. 1 second he was there, and the next he wasn't. He had simply disappeared from existence. Without any pressure on the accelerator, the lorry began to slow down, but unfortunately, there was no hand to steady the wheel. The vehicle started to drift off course, swerving into the middle lane, which caused a driver overtaking to take evasive action. He moved into the third lane and blasted his horn in rebuke, but there was no one in the lorry's cab to hear him. The truck continued to veer to the right, forcing other drivers to perform drastic avoiding maneuvers, but the worst was yet to come. Despite slowing down to around half its original speed of 60 miles per hour, it crashed through the central reservation and into the path of oncoming traffic on the northbound carriageway. This was just before reaching one of the many bridges that spanned the motorway. Immediately, chaos ensued. An Audi, travelling at over 90 miles per hour in the fast lane as the driver rushed to get home after a very important meeting in London, never stood a chance. He collided head-on with the lorry and was killed instantly. Several following vehicles crashed into the wreckage, with a few bursting into flames, resulting in a scene of pure devastation. The collisions caused the lorry to veer backwards towards the central reservation, where it eventually came to a stop when it crashed into one of the pillars that supported the bridge. In the space of a few seconds, Britain had just suffered its worst motorway pile-up in years. While all this was happening, a few miles away in the police station of the local market town, DI Hannah Benson was interviewing a suspect in a small interrogation room. 32 years old, she was in the prime of her life and cut a trim, fit figure topped by her short blonde hair. The man opposite her at the table was of similar age, but significantly less well-kept. The cheap, white Lonsdale t-shirt he was wearing was stained and had small holes starting to form in it. He also looked as if he hadn't washed for a couple of days, and he certainly hadn't shaved. The room wasn't air-conditioned, and there were beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead, merely adding to the nervous vibes he was giving off. That wasn't all the man was exuding. In the warm summer weather, it was apparent he hadn't been acquainted with any deodorant for a while. There was little doubt about the man's guilt in Hannah's eyes. 33-year-old Harry Richards was a convicted sex offender who had served time and recently been let out of jail on licence. Hannah's opinion was that he shouldn't have been let out at all given his record, but it wasn't her job to make the rules. She just enforced them. "I didn't do anything," he insisted. "I've got 2 witnesses who say otherwise. Lifeguards at the outside swimming pool. I was just adjusting myself. They get very sticky on a hot day like this." "You were not adjusting yourself. You were flashing your aroused genitals at a group of women in the ladies' changing room. It's all been caught on camera, so there is no point trying to deny it." "I demand to see a solicitor." "One has been called," she said, "but I doubt it will do you much good. You've got form, as one of my predecessors in this role used to say." "What if I say I identify as a woman? Can't do anything then, can you?" "Your attire, stubble, and general appearance would suggest otherwise," replied Hannah. A knock on the door interrupted the interview, and a young female officer who had been observing the interview opened it to inquire as to the cause of the interruption. Turning back towards the table, she motioned for Hannah to come over. "What is it, Constable Stevens?" "We've got a situation," said the younger woman in a low voice. "You're needed out front?" "Fine," said Hannah, annoyed at the interruption. "Keep an eye on him." She suspended the interview and went out to the front desk, where her colleague, Adrian Johnson, was being harangued by a familiar figure. It was a local farmer named Arthur Tuddenham. On seeing him, she was annoyed. Surely she hadn't been dragged out of the meeting just to deal with yet another one of his endless complaints. Despite the clement weather, Arthur was wearing heavy-duty clothing, including a pair of muddy boots, thick brown trousers, a waxed barber jacket, and a green flat cap. This outfit never seemed to vary, no matter what time of year Hannah encountered him, and she ran into him a lot. He was always turning up at the station, moaning about everything from errant ramblers to the local doggers, who, he claimed, were having gangbangs behind one of his barns. "It's no good you saying you've got an emergency," said Arthur. "I want to know what you're going to do about these cattle rustlers. I've had 2 cows go missing today in broad daylight. Do you have any idea how much those freezers cost? Over $2,000. Probably more like 3 now, what with all this inflation. And are the supermarkets going to pay me more for my milk to reflect this? Are they I'm sorry, Mr. Tuddenham, but like I said, we've got an emergency and we're very short-staffed," said Adrian, interrupting him before he could utter the obscenity. "If you come back tomorrow, I promise we'll give it our full attention." "That's bloody typical of you lot," said Arthur, as he made his way to the door. "Wash your hands of it as usual. This would never have happened in Kent's day." "Very little ever happened in Kent's day," said Hannah. "As Sergeant Johnson said, we'll deal with it tomorrow. Oh, and I do hope you haven't parked that tractor of yours across the exit again. I'll issue you with a ticket if you have." Arthur quickened his pace towards the door, suggesting that he had indeed been amiss in his choice of parking spot. With him gone, Adrian briefed Hannah on the news of the pile-up on the M40. The emergency services were already on the scene, but it looked very bad and they needed more senior officers to assist with the investigation into the cause of the crash. She had been scheduled to clock off at 6, which was in less than an hour, but it went with the territory of the job that she couldn't always be home on time to see her 3-year-old daughter Jess. Most of the time, she lived the life of a single parent. She was in a relationship with a man called Peter who travelled in time, and he was currently away. He wouldn't return until the following year. Fortunately, Hannah had a good support network, and at that moment, one of her closest friends, Kaylee, was taking care of Jess for her. Kaylee had recently returned from her final year at university and was more than happy to lend a hand. After making a couple of calls in her office confirming that things were in a bad way on the motorway, Hannah agreed to go and assist with the investigation. This meant that she would not be able to spend any more time interviewing Harry Richards. Consequently, she made the necessary arrangements to have him put in a holding cell for the night and left Adrian in charge. What she saw when she reached the location of the accident was not a pretty sight. The lorry was blocking part of the northern carriageway along with at least 6 other vehicles that had crashed into it. It was apparent from the body bags being loaded into ambulances that there had been fatalities, and the fire crews were still busy cutting people out of a couple of cars. She had no idea at this stage if they were alive or dead. The road had been closed in both directions and, other than the sounds of the equipment being used on the stricken vehicles, there was an eerie silence, despite the large number of emergency vehicles in attendance. "Hannah," called a familiar voice from close to the lorry's cab. "Over here." She recognized the voice immediately. It was that of DCI Dan Bradley, a veteran of the force from Oxford with over 3 decades of experience. He was close to retirement and a little too old school for her liking, reminding her of her old boss Richard Kent. Nevertheless, his presence in the hellhole around her was a reassuring one. "What the hell happened here, Dan?" she asked. "That's what we're trying to find out," he said. "It appears that this lorry veered across the road and broke through the central reservation." "Any theories about why?" "Well, it can't be to do with the weather. I did see something like this over 30 years ago, not long after this stretch first opened, but it was in the dark, in thick fog and icy conditions." "Could the driver have had a heart attack, or fallen asleep at the wheel? It does happen," said Hannah, trying to come up with some other explanation. "Well, that's the oddest thing. We can't find him." "He's done a runner." "I don't see how he could have. I mean, look at the state of it." The front of the lorry was completely smashed in where it had hit the pillar. It was hard to imagine anyone inside being in any fit state to flee the scene. "I see what you mean. Thank goodness that pillar is made of solid stuff. I don't want to even think about what might have happened if the bridge had come down," she said, noticing the cameras on top of the bridge before adding, "Is there any footage from those cameras up there?" "They're checking it now." "There will be dashcam film from within the cab too," she said. "Maybe that could shed some light on what happened." "Maybe," said Dan, "but I still find it incredible that he's not in the cab." The fireman who investigated said it was basically impossible. Even if he wasn't injured, which would have been miraculous, the door was so badly mangled he wouldn't have been able to open it. "What do we know about him?" Jake Rogers, aged 49, with over 25 years of experience driving heavy goods vehicles. Clean license, clean record, family man, no known medical problems. "Sounds as reliable as they come," said Hannah. "He was," replied Dan. "So I am racking my brains for an explanation of why or how this could have happened. And he can't tell us, not until we find him. If we find him." "What do you mean?" "He must be here somewhere. I already told you he cannot possibly have got away." "Then where is he?" Dan just looked at her, with a thoughtful expression on his face. It was a mystery which put him in mind of some similar unexplained disappearances, way back in 1992, when he had been a young officer in Oxford. Most of those people had reappeared eventually, but it had been a strange few weeks, for which he had never come up with any sort of adequate explanation. The clean-up operation took many hours, extending long into the night. Hannah got away at about 10 p.m, and when she returned home, she found Kaylee curled up on the sofa watching a drama series on the television. "Kaylee, I'm so sorry," she said. "Thank you so much for staying. I can't tell you how grateful I am." "Hey, that's okay," said Kaylee, sitting up and letting her long blonde hair fall loose across her shoulders. "I didn't have anywhere special to be tonight. Charlie's out with Josh having a few drinks in Oxford to celebrate their graduation. It's the first chance they've had since we got back from Bristol." "Did Jess go off to sleep all right?" "Yeah, she's been as good as gold. I bathed her about 7, read her a story, and she was asleep not long after." "Is everything okay? I saw on the news about the crash. It looked awful." "It was," she said. "I don't know about you, but I could do with a drink. Do you fancy cracking open a bottle of wine? I could do with a glass after the day I've had." "I won't say no," said Kaylee. "What have you got?" "There's a nice drop of Chardonnay in the fridge. I popped it in there this morning before I left. I so much prefer white wine when the weather is hot like this, don't you? After the summer we've had, we should make the most of this weather while it lasts." "I like white, but Charlie always insists on red," said Kaylee. "Between you and me, I think he fancies himself as a bit of a wine snob." "Peter's a bit like that too," said Hannah. "From what little I remember. God, I miss him. How many years are we going to have to be apart like this? It gets harder every time he goes away. At least you have Jess. And all of us, of course. Where would I be without you, said Hannah. Come on, let's get this open and go and sit on the decking. It's lovely at this time of night. Over the next hour, Hannah felt the stresses of the day melt away as she and Kaylee chatted over the wine. Try as she might, Hannah often found it difficult to switch off from work, particularly after harrowing scenes such as those she had witnessed today. Thankfully, tonight the younger woman's company really helped. Unfortunately, her respite from the rigours of work was to be short-lived. After a few hours of welcome sleep, her phone rang just before 7 o'clock the following morning. On the other end of the line was a panicked officer who had been on overnight duty at the station. He was calling her with the last thing she wanted to hear. In less than an hour, she was in the station, demanding answers. "What do you mean? He's escaped, Sergeant Smith." "I mean just that," said the man in front of her with a bewildered look on his face. "When? How? I don't know. You're meant to check on him every 30 minutes, did you?" "Of course I did, and he was there, sleeping all night." "When did you last see him?" "About 6:30, then I checked again at 7 and the cell was empty." "I want to see for myself," said Hannah. So she and Sergeant Smith headed for the cells so she could examine the scene in detail. "I don't understand this," she said. "There's no sign of any damage to the door or the lock, or the window, come to that. Maybe he had a key." "From where?" asked Hannah. "And even so, how would he have got through the security door? Or someone sprung him? Without you or anyone else seeing? I take it you have checked the CCTV?" "Yes, and no one's been in or out the whole time. It's a classic locked room mystery, isn't it?" said Smith. "It reminds me of a show I used to watch with my dad when I was a kid about this oddball who lived in a windmill. He used to solve stuff like this all the time." "Do you mean Jonathan Creek?" asked Hannah. "Yes, that's the chap. Maybe we should send for him, eh, boss?" "This isn't a matter for flippancy, Sergeant. A prisoner in our care has escaped. Do you have any idea how much trouble that puts me in, and you, come to that? We're not popular with the top brass up here as it is. The Commissioner has had it in for us ever since he fell out with Kent a few years ago. Ah, yes, the dreaded Gideon Summerfield. Please don't even mention his name. It sends shivers down my spine every time I hear it. Maybe we should keep it quiet while we look for him," suggested Smith. "That is the last thing we should do. It will make things even worse. I need to submit a report right away. If I don't, then it will look like we're trying to cover it up. In the meantime, get Johnson down here and organise a search." She was so stressed by the situation that it didn't immediately occur to her to connect the previous day's incident with Jake Rogers to this latest disappearance. She was more concerned with the dressing down she was going to get from above, and it wasn't long in coming. Summerfield wasn't known for mincing his words, and he gave it to her with both barrels on a video call. "No, we cannot keep it quiet, Benson. We've got a convicted sex offender on the loose. If he assaults someone, and it turned out we didn't warn the public, our reputation will be in the gutter, which it practically already is in your town thanks to years of ineptitude from that dinosaur Kent." She was left in the unenviable position of having to issue a press release, as well as social media statements informing the local populace of the escape. This, as always, did not go down well. She hated issuing tweets from the official local police force account because all that ever came back in response was ridicule and abuse. She didn't even bother looking at the replies anymore, but was assured by Smith that they were almost universal in their condemnation. They varied from the relatively minor accusations of incompetence to much more sinister allegations, suggesting everything the police did was part of some sort of global master plan to enslave the people. As far as she was concerned, she was just doing her job. To make matters worse, Johnson, having agreed to come back to the station to assist, never showed up. Dealing with an escaped prisoner was hard enough, without having to chase errant staff as well. It was annoying because he was usually so reliable. It was her second stressful day in a row. But the worst, by far, was still to come. Chapter 2, July 2023. "Oh, never again," said Josh, as he rummaged around in the fridge of his student flat, desperately looking for some orange juice to ease his hangover. There was none. Typical. He had tried labelling his stuff, but it was to no avail. "And there was me thinking sharing a student house would be fun," he added. "It's been a bloody nightmare." "Yeah, well, you're not technically a student anymore, are you?" said Charlie from the sofa in the open-plan apartment where he had crashed the night. "Neither of us are. Now the grown-up stuff begins. Speaking of which, perhaps we ought to adopt a more mature approach to alcohol. I'm seriously hanging here." "That's good, coming from you," said Josh. "I told you we should have gone home after the pub shut, but you insisted on going to a club." "Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time," said Charlie. "But I hadn't seen you since before our finals, and now it's all done and dusted. We had every reason to celebrate." "Yeah, well, now you're back in Oxford, I dare say we'll see each other more often. A shame you went to Bristol, really. It's hardly got the same kudos as Oxbridge, has it?" "I suppose not. Have you got anything to eat?" asked Charlie. "Chance would be a fine thing. There's nothing in this fridge at all. Thieves and vagabonds, the people I've been living with, the lot of them. I didn't have that problem in Bristol. Kaylee and I had our own place." "Yeah, well, you wouldn't have been able to afford that in Oxford. I read a report the other day that said we've got the highest cost of living in Britain here. No wonder everyone's been nicking your food then. Thing is, I'm the only one still here. All the others have gone home and I need to be out of here this weekend." Emma was the last to leave. She went yesterday. "I reckon it was her that emptied the fridge before she left. I had some bacon and eggs in there I was going to cook this morning. That's gone. So much for her claiming to be a vegan. Thank God I'll never have to see her again. It's been a year of hell sharing a house with her." "I take it you didn't get on?" "No. She accused me of being arrogant." "Me? Arrogant? Can you believe it?" "I'm saying nothing," said Charlie, who had known Josh for a long time. "But not to worry, we can go to a cafe in town. And after that, I've got to get back home to Kaylee. She was babysitting for Hannah last night." "You two couldn't be more like an old married couple if you tried," said Josh. "Still, moving back into your mum's place must have cramped your style a bit. Is that a temporary or a permanent arrangement?" "Hopefully only until we both get jobs, but the price of rent around here is shocking, as you well know. Still, it could be worse. We could be living at her parents' place. You know what her sister's like." "Ah, yes, the delightful Olivia. How could two siblings be so different?" "Indeed. Anyway, like I said, it won't be long. I've got all sorts of leads on LinkedIn. What about Kaylee? What opportunities are there for someone with a degree in meteorology? Weather girl? There can't be that many vacancies for them." "You'd be surprised how many people the Met Office employs," said Charlie. "It's not just about standing in front of a screen pointing at a map, you know. But whatever she decides to do, there is no need to hurry into anything. We want to make the most of this summer before we get tied down to full-time jobs for the next 40 years. "Fair enough. I suppose we better get our acts together. I need to pack up the rest of my stuff today. Whatever I've got left, anyway. I wouldn't put it past that Emma to have nicked more than just the contents of the fridge." After a slap-up breakfast at Charlie's favourite cafe on Broad Street, they went their separate ways, and Josh made his way back to the college at which he had been an undergraduate for the past 3 years. His destination was Professor Anthony Hamilton's lab, a place he had been frequenting during the past year. Hamilton was not only his tutor but also a passionate scientist specialising in experiments with tachyonic particles. He had been trying to make a breakthrough in this discipline for many years in the hope of proving that time travel was possible. So far, he had been unsuccessful. His obsession was right up Josh's alley, as he had first-hand experience of time travel using a time bubble a few years previously. And that wasn't his only time-travelling encounter. About a year and a half ago, he had run into a man at Cheltenham races who had claimed to be a time traveller and asked him to meet him on a specific date in 1990. This was a peculiar request, considering it was currently 2023, but he couldn't doubt the man's knowledge. He had known the result of every race on the card in advance. This encounter inspired him to get involved with his tutor's work. It was rare for the members of the Time Bubble team to share their knowledge outside the group, but Josh had convinced them to allow him to confide in Professor Hamilton about his experiences. During his final year of study, he had found himself spending increasing amounts of time in the lab, discussing theories and talking about whether they could pool their resources and make controlled time travel a reality. Sometimes he felt as if Hamilton were holding back on him and knew more about the subject than he was letting on. Sometimes, usually after a few drinks, he would make outlandish claims, such as on one occasion when he was adamant that he had seen a dinosaur in Oxford in 1992. He often backtracked on these in the cold light of the following day, claiming it was just a joke, but it was always difficult to tell with Hamilton. His mentor had more than a hint of the classic mad professor look about him, with his wild white hair and beard. Consequently, many years ago, the students had bestowed the nickname Gandalf upon him. Despite pushing retirement age, he was still a lively figure, and when he got exceptionally excited about something, he became very animated and his Scottish accent grew stronger. Josh wasn't sure how long he had been at the college, but as with numerous aging Oxford academics, it appeared as though he had been there forever, and would be there forever. Such was the timeless nature of life at the university. He was clearly in fine fettle when Josh entered the lab on this sunny Saturday, rushing over and enthusiastically shaking hands as if they were being acquainted for the first time. "Josh, my boy, an absolute delight to see you. I take it the finals went well?" "I believe they did," said Josh, assured that they had. He was, even if he said so himself, somewhat of a mathematical genius. "Never in doubt, my dear fellow, you were always going to pass with flying colours. I take it you've been celebrating in the appropriate style? If you don't mind my saying, you look a little rough around the edges this morning. Take it from one who knows. Perhaps a hair of the dog might be in order. I'm sure I got a drop of Glenmorangie knocking around here somewhere." "It's been a pretty wild week," admitted Josh, who was indeed still feeling a little ropey despite the large breakfast. "I think I'll pass on the whiskey, though, if you don't mind. It's a little early for that." "As long as you've been enjoying yourself, that's the main thing. You've earned it. But it's time to think of the future now, laddie. And a very bright future it's going to be for you too." "You seem very confident of that," said Josh. "Oh, I am, my boy, I am. And it all begins right here today. You see, I have a little proposal for you, an offer you can't refuse, you could say." This wasn't entirely unexpected. Hamilton had dropped several hints about what he had in mind in recent weeks, and Josh had already guessed what was coming, but he didn't say anything to spoil Hamilton's big reveal. "Tell me more," he said, with a curious look on his face, as he tried to make out that he didn't have a clue what Hamilton was talking about. "I've been very impressed with you, young man, and the help you've given me this past year has been invaluable. Now that you've finished your degree, I can't bear to think of your talents going to waste in some unworthy institution elsewhere. If that rogue Garfunkel at Cambridge got his mitts on you, I'd never forgive myself. So, how do you fancy coming to work here with me? We'll carry on our time travel work, and you can study for a postgraduate degree with a view to taking on some lecturing as part of your future role." "Oh, what can I say?" said Josh. "It's a very tempting offer." "And a very lucrative one," said Hamilton. "You'll be starting on a minimum of 60,000, rising rapidly thereafter. We look after our own here, and that's very much what I see you as. This is not just a job, it's a family. I can't go on forever, and I need to know my life's work is in safe hands." "You see me as your prodigy?" "Absolutely, dear boy. I have no heir, and I've been waiting for years for a student to come along with a mind to challenge my own. I was beginning to lose hope, but then you arrived. What do you say?" Josh paused for a moment, wrinkling up his face into a pensive facade as if he was giving careful consideration to the proposal. In truth, he was doing no such thing. He had anticipated the offer, and it was everything he wanted. He loved being at the college, and having continued access to the lab and all the other facilities would enable him to continue pursuing his long-term goal. One day, he would create a device that would enable him to create time bubbles like the one he had found 5 years ago. After letting the professor sweat a bit, he announced, "I'd be delighted. Now I just need to find somewhere to live. The lease on my student house runs out this weekend." "Wonderful, my boy, wonderful," said Hamilton, enthusiastically grabbing Josh's hand and pumping it with a way-over-the-top handshake. "You won't regret it, and don't worry about the accommodation. The university owns plenty of desirable dwellings in the city. As I said before, we look after our own." As Josh's career prospects were on the rise, his ex-girlfriend Lauren was seeing hers heading in the opposite direction. She too was on the move, but for the wrong reasons. The two of them had been an on-off item for a couple of years during sixth form and his first year at university, but neither of them was committed and eventually agreed to stay friends but go their separate ways. She had stayed in the city, sharing a flat with another girl, but the rent was exorbitant. Despite working all the hours she could get, she still struggled to get by, and now she was completely out of options. She had recently been let go by the beautician she had been working for. Her boss claimed it was due to lack of work, but she knew the truth was that they just didn't want her. If she was brutally honest with herself, she had to admit that she didn't want them either. The job had been one long disappointment. It had been marginally better than her attempt to be a hairdresser, but not much. Rather than styling the hair of the rich and famous, which was what she had envisaged, that job had turned out to be mostly listening to old ladies rambling on about their ailments. She was young and needed a job where she could meet and interact with people her own age. Her favourite thing was bar work, but that was unreliable and didn't pay enough for her to make her way. Eventually, broke and with the credit card debts mounting up, she had no choice but to bite the bullet and go home to her mother, Patricia. It was a reunion she was dreading. Quite simply, she and her mother just did not get along. Lauren had a free-spirited nature and enjoyed living life on her own terms, something which attracted maternal disapproval. She found her mother to be strict and overly serious. If she had ever known how to have fun, it was a long time in the past. She was also very skeptical of people and institutions, especially the media and the government. It was all she ever went on about. Lauren could sort of sympathise with that. She was no fan of authority herself, but did her mother have to bang on and on about it all the time? She had never seen her laugh or barely even smile. Virtually every conversation they had had since she had been a young teenager had ended up in an argument. There was no father to smooth the situation. He was long gone. Occasionally, her mother made a token effort, asking if she wanted to go somewhere with her or watch TV with her, but it was always utterly boring places like garden centres or equally tedious programmes about gardening and home makeovers. Or even worse, endless YouTube videos about the latest conspiracy theories. Lauren had come back from Oxford on the bus, lugging a heavy suitcase that contained pretty much all her worldly goods. It wasn't much to show for 3 years in the city. The bus driver had been quite young and friendly, and she had tried flirting with him to take her mind off her impending return home. Smiling from her pretty round face, she flicked at the edge of her black bob of hair with her fingers as she waited for him to give out her change. He smiled back and then made a point of flashing his wedding ring at her. It just wasn't her day. Back at the house, she pulled out the front door key that she hadn't used in over 3 years, took a deep breath and went to open the door. But she didn't need the key, the door was already unlocked. That meant her mother was at home. It was to be expected, she supposed, with it being Saturday lunchtime. She had rung home earlier in the week to give advance warning she was coming, which had not been well received. There had been much moaning about not having enough food in the house, or the bed not being made up. As usual, it quickly escalated into a row after Lauren suggested that 4 days should be ample time to go shopping and sort out the sheets. It was obvious she was not wanted there, and she prayed this would be a temporary arrangement. She could hear the television was on and made her way through to the darkened living room where her mother was watching TV with the curtains closed. She barely looked up as Lauren came in. "Oh, you're here then," she said. "Obviously," replied Lauren, looking to see what her mother was watching. It was some bloke in a small room with various pieces of memorabilia from well-known science fiction shows and movies displayed on shelves behind him. He was talking very fast and was clearly excited about something. "Who's this?" she asked. "That's Mystic Mick," she said. "You must know who Mystic Mick is." "Should I?" "Of course. He reveals the truths the real media won't touch. You won't get this on BBC News." "I don't watch the BBC News. I don't watch any news. I don't see the point. I'd rather just get on and live my life." "Of course you would," said Patricia. "All you care about is where your next drink and fuck is coming from." Oh, what a dreadful thing to say to your only daughter. It's true, though, isn't it? If it doesn't come in a bottle or a pair of trousers, you're not interested. Just because you're past it, if you ever had it. I was young once, you know. Yeah, about a century ago. So what's Mystic Mick on about? It's not the moon landings again, is it? No, it's about these people going missing. You should watch it. Must I? Indulge me. I am letting you live here after all. This is my childhood home. What parent would turn their only child away? Actually, don't answer that. Just listen, said Patricia, reaching for the remote and turning up the volume. And they haven't said a word on the news about it, said Mystic Mick. But I'm telling you now, the driver of that truck was nowhere to be found after the accident. Now you tell me, how can a driver in the middle of all this carnage simply disappear? The video cut to a screenshot of the aftermath of the chaos on the M40. I tell you, he can't, which makes me question whether this even was an accident. What are they hiding? And he isn't the only one. Take a look at this woman. The video cut to a still of a professional-looking lady in a smart business suit aged around 40. This is Lorraine Green, a newly appointed board member of one of Britain's biggest high street banks. According to inside sources, she excused herself yesterday afternoon during a meeting break, went into the ladies' room and never came out. CCTV confirmed this. Where did she go? They were on the 33rd floor and there was no other way out, so what happened to her? Her husband and young children are beside themselves with worry, and well, they should be. Did the state have something against Mrs. Green? Did she know something they wanted buried? These questions need to be answered. For God's sake, Mum, you don't really believe all this rubbish, do you? It's a lovely afternoon, the first decent spell of weather we've had for weeks. Why are you sitting in here watching this with the curtains closed? It's not rubbish, insisted Patricia. Anyway, it's my house and my television. I'll do what I want. Of course you will, Lauren replied. You always have. She turned, left the room and headed up the stairs. Up in her old teenage bedroom, she found a quilt cover, pillowcase and sheet neatly folded on top of her bed. Her mother hadn't even bothered to make it up. As for the rest of the room, there was not an inch of spare floor space. It appeared that her mother had taken to using it as a storeroom and had stockpiled it to the ceiling with enough food to feed an army. There were hundreds of tins of fruit, tuna and ham, along with powdered milk and countless other foodstuffs. There were also dozens of large bottles of water, the gallon-sized ones you often found in supermarkets in holiday resorts. So much for the conversation on the phone earlier in the week when she claimed she didn't have enough food. It was a wonder the floorboards hadn't caved in. Why would her mother ever need so much stuff, and why would she fill her room with it? It wasn't even worth trying to figure out the workings of her disturbed mind. All Lauren knew was that the sooner she got a job and got out of this place, the better.